Okay, so we are recording this webinar and we will send out the link to the YouTube once we get that put up, and also all the links that Steph is going to share in the chat with us tonight. And if you have any questions, please do feel free to put those in the chat. I will try to answer those as we go, but I will also circle back to them at the end if I don't get those answered or don't see them. And Steph can also always unmute and let me know if there's questions that you have. Closed captioning should be turned on as well. So if you need to turn that on, please do that also. So again, tonight we're going to talk about inspiring and refining scientific questions. And first, I would just like to do a land acknowledgement. So we are coming to you from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, which is part of Cornell University, which is located on the traditional homelands of the Gayakono, the Cayuga Nation. The Gayakono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of the Gayakono disposition and honor their ongoing connection of the Gayakono people, past and present, to these lands and waters. So like I said, we are part of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and if you're new with us, the Cornell Lab of Ornithology is a member-based nonprofit organization whose mission is to interpret and conserve the Earth's biological diversity through research, education, and participatory science focused on birds and nature. And the webinar tonight is part of our K-12 education team, and we try to create innovative resources and deliver informative trainings that will empower educators to build young people's science skills through nature, participatory science, and inquiry as well. And my name is Susan Licker. I'm the learning coordinator, and online with us tonight is Steph Somerville Zamora, who is our program assistant. And again, she'll be answering any questions or putting in links as they come up for us. So how do we meet our mission? We really believe we kind of have 3 pillars, which our mission stands on, which is nature connection, participatory science, and inquiry investigations. And we have resources and training across the spectrum of those 3 pillars. Everything from single lesson plans to full units, which we're going to talk about tonight with our Students as Scientists unit. And trainings, again, everything from something like this webinar where we're, 1 hour virtual with you all the way up to multi-day workshops. And I will tell you about one of those at the very end. But there's just lots of opportunities to engage with us, and we hope that you'll explore our website and those offerings if you haven't already. So for tonight's webinar, we are going to explore how our free Students as Scientists unit scaffolds the inquiry process. We'll do some practicing of observing and wondering so that we can get to those good questions. And then we'll consider what makes a testable question. How do we get to that point? And then how do we're going to also refine and practice our own curious questions and refining those into testable questions. So that's what's on the agenda for tonight. And we'll start out with doing a bit of discovery about our Students as Scientists nature-based inquiry unit. This is really a unit that uses nature to inspire student curiosity and scientific investigations. It is completely free and downloadable from our website. It is also grade banded, so you might know our old unit, which was called Investigating Evidence, and that was a K through 12 resource. But through the years, it was educators had really asked for us to differentiate that between grades. And so we landed on having a K5 version and a 612 version. So both of them have 6 lessons. Of course, those are differentiated between those grade bands. Both of them do have a slide deck that comes along with it and editable and adaptable handouts that, again, are really in the Google Suite, which you can download or make a copy of and make those your own. They're there for you to use as you see fit. Um, and the intent really is to be able to give you everything that you need to guide your students through the inquiry process. Steph has put that in the chat, and it's also just there on your screen if you want to see it that way. I see somebody has a raised hand. Can you put your question in the chat? The I do want to just kind of go over the main components of the Students of Scientists. So lesson one really is about exploring science for your students. So that's understanding what is science, that it's one way of knowing what the nature of science is, that it's iterative, that, it's really, it is a body of knowledge as well, but it's also about who are scientists and how do scientists do their jobs? What tools do they need? What skills do they need? Tonight, we're going to focus in on lesson 2 and 3, so making observations and asking scientific questions. Lesson 4 is really about designing your investigation, and that's a big chunk that takes some time. But again, we guide you through that and help you through that process. In between lesson 4 and lesson 5 is where your students would collect their data. It's not specified here in the contents, but that is really because it is more open-ended. It kind of sits between those two lessons. And then we analyze evidence, which is really about looking at patterns and relationships in the evidence that your students collected. And then finally, it's interpreting that evidence and sharing those results. And interpreting really is how to make meaning of the data that was collected. And it's really using the evidence that they collected, scientific reasoning, in order to get to a claim that they can make about their investigation. And then finally, of course, sharing results, which is so important whenever we're doing science. So like I said, the unit is really designed to take students through the entire scientific inquiry process. And in the past, or maybe even currently, the scientific method was used to teach how science was conducted. But this representation doesn't really capture the whole complexity and true nature of science. So part of the development of this unit, we worked with scientists at the lab to develop the graphic that you're seeing on the screen right now that really shows a more realistic way of doing science. You can see that there is a general flow to the process, that there are parts and you can generally follow it around. But there's also arrows indicating that you can go back and repeat a portion of the process. Sometimes scientists might even need to go back more than one step. Sometimes they might toggle between two, go back and forth. But again, just this idea that it's a bit more complex than just the scientific method. And you'll also notice that communicate and collaborate are in the center, and that this communication and collaboration is really happening throughout the process, that it's not a single time when we're sharing out our results, but that it's really happening throughout. So when I talk about inquiry, there are different levels of inquiry, and I want to take a moment just to talk about those. The kind of intent of this unit is that you could use it to do open inquiry. So on this continuum of confirmation inquiry to open inquiry, the intent is for you to be able to use it to do completely open inquiry, but doesn't mean that you have to. And it's still a valuable resource if you're doing confirmation, structured, or guided inquiry. I will also say that in our youngest learners, sometimes confirmation inquiry is really needed to help them understand the process of science. Sometimes, even our middle schoolers might need to go back to that so that they can really develop an understanding of science and science skills that are needed. It's also possible that when you're using this unit, you might want to do part of it. So, we talked about wondering and observing. We talked about questions, designing the investigation. There might be parts of it where you're going to use kind of more the open inquiry. So maybe when they're observing and writing down their questions, you might have an open inquiry where they're kind of free to explore topics that they're interested in. But then once you get to designing the investigation, maybe you want to do a more structured inquiry. But again, you can kind of mix and match with these and really use what works best for your students, for sure, knowing where they're at. So sometimes diving right into inquiry can be a big ask. So there's a couple of tools that we developed to help with taking a step into inquiry. One of these is our Spark guides, and these guides are really intended to be an easy entry point to spark your students' curiosity and to kind of begin both your journey and their journey into science inquiry. And Steph put a link in the chat again. And depending on you and your students, you could choose one topic that will work best, or you might pick a few different ones to do. So again, these are really intended just to help kind of spark that curiosity and begin thinking about science. Another thing that we did for the K through 5 version, um, especially where there is either a time limit for science instruction or you're just getting started with scientific inquiry. Obviously, you all have a huge job where you're teaching everything. And so in the elementary version, we did pull out some specific activities from each lesson that would kind of help give you a simplified roadmap into scientific inquiry and doing all of those different steps. So in scientific inquiry, observing and wondering really are key parts. And tonight we are going to focus on those two aspects of the science process. Again, those are really some great starting points as far as when we're thinking about inquiry. So we're going to start out in lesson 2, and this is where we really make observations. There are 4 activities to support observation. And we are tonight, during this webinar, we will observe a phenomenon and we'll also talk about observation versus inference. We're going to talk a little bit more about the wonder wall in lesson 3 tonight. The wonder wall is really just a nice either physical or digital space to collect questions. And then one of my favorite activities in this unit really is observing at different scales. And in this activity, they are looking both at a big picture. So in the same class time, they would be looking at big picture. So going outdoors and observing, kind of all around us, what is happening. And then also doing a tiny hike. And so looking very closely at a single little bit of space and looking at it closely versus kind of that big picture. And so these two different perspectives can really spark some different questions and different investigations. So it's a nice way for them to practice observations. And we believe that good questions really start with good observations. And I put this little video in here just because I found it recently and I absolutely loved it. And so I wanted you all to enjoy it a little bit too. It's just a nice visual. But we believe that good questions start with good observations. And so, and also that observation is a skill that students can practice. And, younger students can be pretty adept at observations, but, sometimes not. And then also for older students and even us as adults, we can kind of get stuck in our heads and forget to really pay attention and observe what's going on around us. So when you're doing this activity, you may want to give your students a prompt to keep them focused just on observing. A prompt might be, I notice. So again, they're really honing in on that observation because this activity really is all about asking them to observe and not to ask questions yet, which is a very natural tendency as we observe something and then we start wondering about it. But right now we're really honing in on that observation piece. And so some of the options, you could use a photo or video of an animal. You might use a live cam. Obviously, a natural item that you can bring into the classroom is an option. Or you could also go outdoors and do some observations. Tonight we are going to practice this, but I'm hoping that some of you have some amazing spring weather, which I have right now, and that you want to get outside. So I'm going to we're going to do this, but we're going to do it in combination with our wondering practice, our questioning practice. They're going to be two separate, but I want to do them at the same kind of break within the webinar so that you actually are able to do both and are able to get outside. But again, when you're doing this as a unit, these would be two very separate activities. So if we go then next into asking questions, in this lesson, we brainstorm questions. We talk about different ways to answer scientific questions. There's a time to wonder. We also talk about refining scientific questions, and this is really only in the 6 to 12 grade band, but it's really important for the K-5 teachers to understand it. So we're going to walk through all of that tonight as well. And then finally, you choose your testable question. So again, remember that in the unit, lesson 2, you observed a phenomenon. In lesson 3, when you're brainstorming these questions, you're going to revisit that same phenomenon so that they can kind of connect that those observations are what are generating those questions. So if you used I noticed as the prompt for your observation phenomenon, a nice pairing to that could be I wonder for this brainstorming questions. So tonight, because we are going to do this in two separate ways, I invite you, when you're on your way out the door, pick up a piece of paper, a pencil, and divide your paper in half and put an I notice column and an I wonder column. So again, to give you your brain that kind of visual prompt that you're doing observations only, and then you're going to ask your questions. So what I'm going to do now is, again, if you have nice weather, please go outside, take time to observe. I'm going to ask you to do an observation for 3 minutes outdoors of just observations. And then when you come up, and then set a timer for yourself, and then do 3 minutes of writing down the questions you have about that phenomenon. And we are going to use those questions a little bit later. So I'm dismissing you not dismissing you from the room, stay in the room, but leave your computer screen, go outside if you have the space and time. I'm going to set a timer for 7 minutes. That gives you a minute to get out the door, 3 minutes to do your observations, 3 minutes to write your questions, and a minute to get back. So I'm going to go ahead and start my timer. And if you don't have an outdoor space, you're welcome to stay here with me. And I am going to play this video. So again, remember we're looking at the same phenomenon. I'm going to play this video and we're going to write down our observations first, and then I'll replay it and we'll write down our questions. That's our time. So I'm going to take it back to the beginning. And now I want you to write down those questions. What questions do you have about it? Okay, we probably have a little bit longer for our friends who are outside to come back. So I'm going to give them just a little bit longer. Okay, my timer went off, so I'm going to go ahead and come back to this slide. Normally, I would have you write down your observations, throw those in the chat, which you can if you want. But what I really want to to focus on is your questions. I say that. I'm sorry. I'm going to back up. I'm not going to have you share either one of those just yet. What I want to talk about next is go back to those observations. And I want to pause and talk about observations versus inferences. Um, when we're making observations, we're also often making inferences. And so you've probably heard a student say something like, look, those girls are kissing, or that bird's telling the other one how to get home. And sometimes it's hard to decide how to respond. So You might want to correct them and say what you think is happening. Other times you might be tempted to just support it and say, maybe that's what's happening. I know that's what I do a lot. Um, but one of the most powerful things we can do to inspire more curiosity and to turn experiences like this into an exploration of observation is to explore observation and inferences. So in that situation, start exploring the difference between observation and inferences. And when we're thinking about this, an observation really is something that you can directly experience with your senses. For example, what you see or hear, what you can taste, things like that. Whereas an inference is an explanation or a guess about about your observations, and they're based on what you already know, and then your evidence from your observation. And there's nothing wrong with inferences. We're making them all the time. And you don't want to discourage your students from doing that, but understanding those differences is important. So, um, here in this picture, I can say that this osprey is flying. It has a fish in its talons, and the fish is facing the same way as the osprey. But an inference might be that the osprey is going to eat the fish. I'm not observing it eating it right now, but because I know that an osprey eats fish, that would be an inference that it's going to eat it. Or maybe another one would be the fish is facing forward to help with aerodynamics. So those are the differences. And I just want you to go back to your observations, whether you watched the video or went outside, and see if any of them were inferences for you. Again, just understanding that difference is what we're trying to do. So again, this little activity, this observation versus inference, we do go through that in the unit. That happens right after you're looking at that the phenomenon and making observations. You're going to do the same thing where you go back to those observations and see which ones might be inferences and which ones are actual observations, and just differentiate between those two. So we've done our observations. We have now come back to that same phenomenon and we've asked our questions. In the unit, the next thing that happens is we give them time to wonder. And how you use this activity as far as a wonder wall depends on how you're approaching the unit. So if you're picking a topic for your students, but you're not setting the question, you'll want to set up some opportunities for them to observe and wonder about that topic. So let's say you want them to do some type of investigation around water. You might take them to a local stream so they can observe it. You might have them, observe different water types, one that might be silty and one that might be clear. So again, that they're making those observations and thinking up questions as they're doing it, what they might be interested in. If they're picking their own topic, you're going to want to provide time for them to observe their topic and ask questions, whether that's in class or on their own time. If you're going to work as a class on a single question, you still are going to want to provide those opportunities for them to observe and wonder, whether that's, again, as a class or time outside of class. But this is really, the idea behind this is to take some time to gather these questions, these curious questions that you can put on your wonder wall that then they can choose from to actually go about their investigations, or that you all can choose from to go about their investigations. Once students have had time to come up with those curious questions, it's time to move on to refining those questions into testable questions. And I will tell you, I did my master's in physical geography, and coming up with a testable question is difficult. And that's because our brains have these big ideas, these big questions, but in order for us to actually conduct an experiment or an investigation, it has to be testable. So we're going to watch this video that explains the technique that we use in the unit to help students move from a curious question to a testable question. Again, in the K-5 unit, this is really background information for you, and you're going to lead your class through these concepts.
There's all kinds of different scientists out there, working all over the world in all different kinds of environments, researching all different kinds of topics. But they all have one thing in common. They ask questions.
Scientists are naturally curious, right? So it all starts with sort of just a curiosity to know what's happening in something.
But to actually find out what's happening in something, scientists have to ask a very specific type of question called the testable question. To understand why testable questions are at the heart of science, we're going to look at the work that Kim and Kay are doing. Kay Beidel and Kim Tamatricon are marine microbiologists at Rutgers University.
The work that we're doing is looking at the role that light plays in mediating host-virus interactions in the ocean.
Could light be structuring infection in the infection process itself?
Let's back up. Kim and Kay's team studies the interaction between a tiny phytoplankton called Emiliania huxleyi, or EHUX, and the virus that infects EHUX. These guys are phytoplankton, and they use sunlight to make their own food, which means they need light to grow. These guys infect these guys and kill them. When Kim and Kay were on an expedition together, they wondered whether light was affecting the interaction between hosts and virus. They were curious.
And so I was like, well, how does that work?
Kim wondered, how does light affect this host-virus interaction? While this is a great initial curiosity question that often initiates scientific research, it's not a testable question because
it could be a number of different answers. It can affect the virus itself. It can lead to viral decay. It can enhance growth rate of the host, and so therefore it stimulates viral production. How does light do it is not. There's too many ways to answer that question.
Okay, this distinction may seem a little subtle, so to help understand what makes a question testable, we'll use the SMART acronym, where SMART stands for specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and temporal. We're going to go through each one by taking our initial broad question and then modifying it into an actual testable question that Kay and Kim's team tested. So, starting with S, specific. For a question to be testable, it needs to be specific, meaning you should be asking a question that has one defined answer. This is why you can't just say,
how does light affect host-virus interactions? And there are just a million different ways to answer that. There's no defined answer.
And with no defined answer, you can't design an experiment that will give you meaningful results.
But if you say, does light affect host-virus interactions, then your answer is either yes or it's no.
Now that's specific. Now you can design experiments to test that question.
In order to answer that specific question, we have to design a number of different experiments. It's not one experiment per question.
And that's because light is still very broad. Light can have different intensities, and it can have different wavelengths.
We did an experiment where we infected in the dark, and then we did an experiment where we infected in constant light, and then we did an experiment at different light irradiances.
So for our initial question to be testable, we need to think about how to make it specific. So it becomes this. Does light at different wavelengths and intensities affect host-virus interaction? So, specific, check. Next, M, measurable. A testable question should lead to answers that have measurable results. So is the answer to this question measurable? Well, you can measure the amount of light organisms get. You can measure the brightness of the light. You can measure the amount of infected cells versus non-infected cells in a sample. But if you want to measure the effect of light on the viral process of infection, you have to be able to measure what's going on with just the virus. And one of the challenges that Kim faced is that light affects both hosts and viruses.
And so if you test too big of a range of light, now you've got a situation where not enough light and the host is unhappy, and too much light and the host is unhappy.
Kim and Kay's team were able to find a narrow range of light intensities that affect the virus but keep the host happy. So they know the question they are asking is measurable. So we can modify this question accordingly. Does light at different wavelengths and intensities that don't affect the host affect the virus? So measurable, check. Okay, next, A, achievable. Whether you are in a science class or a professional scientist, you need to ask, do I have the stuff to do this thing in the time I have?
We push our students to recognize that There are constraints in terms of what they can do in the classroom with science, with the time and the supplies that we have, but we parallel this to the constraints that a scientist would see in the field. They have more resources available and more time available to them, but they still go through the same process.
So is our question achievable? Well, to answer this, we need stuff like lights that can be adjusted to specific brightnesses, bottles for samples, a big machine called a flow cytometer that can count infected cells, and finally, you need samples of cells.
The organisms we study, we can grow in the lab and we can do controlled experiments, but ultimately we want to know what are they doing out in nature in this big ocean at this small scale in a really big place. And so we want to try and replicate that. So when we're actually going in and designing a testable question for a process that we're trying to measure at sea, can we achieve that condition that's going to actually allow us to answer that question that we're asking?
So if you have the stuff and you have the time, then it's achievable. Check. So the question becomes, does light at different wavelengths and intensities that don't affect the host affect the virus? Given that our equipment and the time we have allows us to perform an experiment on this organism that can be successfully grown in a lab. Next, relevant. Is this question even relevant? For example, our question so far is specific, measurable, and achievable. But what if here we're asking about wavelengths of light that aren't even present in the ocean? Well, obviously, if these guys live in the ocean and there's not a lot of red and yellow light where they are, it's not relevant to ask about those wavelengths of light. So the question becomes, does light at the wavelengths present in the ocean and intensities that don't affect the host affect the virus? Given that our equipment and the time we have allows us to perform an experiment on this organism that can be successfully grown in a lab. Relevant? Check. Finally, temporal. The question should be grounded in time. So back to our question. Does this question relate to a specific time?
The infection process that we study takes place over a certain, few days, 3 to 4 days. So the experiments that we set up are not gonna run out for weeks at a time. So we may be interested in asking questions within the first 24 hours.
You can't do an experiment that never ends. That's why your testable question has to have a time component to it. Temporal, check. And now finally we have arrived at our big testable question. Does light at the wavelengths present in the ocean and the intensities that don't affect the host affect the virus in the first 24 to 48 hours of infection? Given that our equipment and the time we have allows us to perform. Because professional scientists practice thinking scientifically all the time, they don't need to consciously go through this SMART acronym every time they ask a question, nor do they always arrive at one master question like we've done here. But they are always making sure that the questions they're asking are testable so they can run experiments and get answers that are actually meaningful. If you like the tools of
Okay, so I think you all can probably agree that is quite the question to think about. So, and a pretty complex system. And so it is showing the real life practice of doing science, and that's why we chose to do it. But as part of helping students get to that testable question and how do we get there, we also include a slideshow that I'm going to walk through now to practice creating that testable question with something that might be more realistic in your classroom. So in this case, we're going to pretend that we are students in Florida who are planting a school vegetable garden, and we're curious about where to put the garden, in a more sunny or a more shady place. So this is our original question. Our original curious question is, do plants grow better in sun or shade? And now we're going to go through that process of refining it into a SMART testable question. And so in this case, you would ask your students, does this original question have only one defined answer? Do plants grow better in sun or shade? And you'd give them time to think about that. And of course, no, the answer is no, it's too broad. Different kinds of plants need different sunlight. There can't just be one. So then we would work with our students to come up with some ideas about how we could narrow this. And the way we chose to do it was to focus in on a specific plant. So do snap pea plants grow better in sun or shade? So we're getting to that specific. Yes, they do. They either grow better in shade or better in sun. But it's not measurable. It's still not measurable. So how could we measure the amount of growth in a pea plant? I should have picked a different plant name. Pea plant is a little bit of a tongue twister. Um, but you could do everything from, we picked out that they would produce a greater number of pods. So do snap pea plants produce a greater number of pods in sun or shade? You could also say, ask, do they produce like a greater weight? Do we have a greater weight if it's in sun or shade? Or how tall they grow or how big they grow? And then is it achievable? So we're going now into achievable. Do I have the resources to do this investigation in the time that I have? And so here you would ask your students, what do we need to figure out this question? So, you would need seeds, you need soil, you need water, you need one place that's in the sun, one place that is in the shade. You'd want to make sure that your soil is about the same between those two places. And then, so now that you know what you need to do it, how easy is it to get? Can we get all of these supplies? And so, yes, in this case, we can. And then do we have enough time to conduct the study? So this is where some of your background research is going to come in. From that, we know that peas take about 8 to 10 weeks from the time we plant them to produce the peas. We know that we're in Florida in the spring. We have about 15 weeks to see if they will sprout, grow, and produce peas. So this is achievable. It's an achievable question. And then, is it relevant? Is the question worth asking? So in this case, again, we're going to say yes, because we want to know the best place to put this new school garden. And this experiment's going to help us figure that out. And then temporal. So what is the time frame? Does this question relate to a specific time frame? And right now it doesn't. It just says, do they grow better? We don't know when. Again, from background research, we know it takes them 8 to 10 weeks to mature and start producing seed pods. They're also a cooler weather plant. So we do need to add the temporal part to it to get to our testable question. So our final question becomes, do snap pea plants produce a greater number of pods in sun or shade when planted in February and harvested in April? So now we're to that SMART question. One of the things that the video doesn't go into is that we've added into this is thinking about safety. So safety of humans, of animals, of ecosystems. And the reason we do that is, that is something scientists are thinking about as well. And we have an example here at the lab where we actually, a scientist was going to see if birds would nest in boxes where there was a novel item next to it. Like, did that novel item disturb their nesting patterns? And so they actually decided to put out mesh shower poofs near the nest boxes and see what happened. Well, once they really considered that idea, that design of the investigation, they realized that birds could easily get caught in those poofs. And so they switched to ribbons as the novel item that could maybe interfere with the nesting, but of course wouldn't harm the birds. So again, thinking about safety, both of ourselves and the environment that we're going to be in is part of thinking about testable questions. So now we're going to go into your own questions, but one of the things we do, so once they've kind of had this exposure to these two different SMART questions, as part of refining their questions, we actually have you pair up the students and distribute the observational and experimental Wonderwall questions that have been generated throughout this time, and ask each pair to refine the original question into a SMART testable question. And in this case, they may not have all the background information. So maybe they don't know exactly, that pea plants take 8 to 10 weeks to mature, and so if they don't have that information, they may not be able to be specific in their temporal or whether it's achievable, but getting them to think through that and to even if they don't know for sure, putting that aspect into it. So again, when they pick their question and have their background information, they can actually develop a smart question. So what I would like you to do now is to look back at one of your questions that you came up with, or if you have a question that you already know, that you have a curiosity about, that is an original curious question, I want you to take 5 minutes now to really think through how to make it specific, how to make it measurable, how to make it achievable, reasonable, and temporal. What can you do to create that question into a smart, testable question? And like I said, I think that it is a difficult process to go through. And so I think this smart process really is important, especially for students. Again, like the video said, scientists don't have to do this every time, but they are thinking about each one of these components. And I think, thinking back to my own graduate experience, I didn't have this acronym to help me through that. And I think had I had this acronym, I would have been much better off in thinking how I could convert my curious question into a really good testable question. Okay, so let's start working on those questions. Okay, let's just take another 30 seconds to a minute to kind of wrap up what you're thinking for your testable question. Okay, so once you have your SMART question, um, again, that was really just practice. Your students are going to need to practice that, coming up with a testable question. But once they've refined a question into a testable question in lesson 4, your students, how we have it set up right now is that we don't actually have them doing much background research until lesson 4. And so while they might be choosing a question to design an investigation around, as they do their background information, they might need to tweak that testable question. Again, they might come up upon something that they didn't realize was true. So again, maybe they thought pea plants would sprout and start producing peas within the first 4 weeks. And when they find out that it's 8 to 10 weeks, they need to rethink either their question or, again, making it more into that testable question. And so the background information, that is one of those pieces of the science process that I think often, as scientists, they usually have that background knowledge that they can kind of pull from to get to that question. But with your students, you might need to give them some time to do some background research on their topic so that they can get to this testable question in a way that scientists don't necessarily really need to do. Okay, that leads us to seeing what questions you all have, and I haven't seen any in the chat. I do know the person who had, oh, all right. We had somebody share in the chat, does the location of an owl nest in wetlands or a housing development affect the amount and type of prey owl parents hunt and feed their offspring during the time owlets are in the nest from hatching to flight? That's a great question. Does anybody else want to share one of their testable questions? And so here we're looking at 2 different locations, so it's an either or. We also, are looking at the amount and type of prey that the parents bring. And then again, at that specific time, we're not trying to say over the lifespan of an owl, what do they eat? But while they're in the nest, what are they eating? That's a great question. I think, the other achievable part of that would be like, where are the nest cams? Do we have access to nest cams in both places, or can we put in a nest cam somewhere? How often are the baby barred owls fed in 24-hour period at this time in their development? Oh, that's another great question. So, I like that because it is really achievable. 24 hours, we can, a student could watch a, a wildlife cam for 24 hours to see what it is. And knowing that in reality, that 24-hour period, there's going to be times where they're sleeping. And so you're not going to have to, you won't have to analyze every single moment. You can kind of fast forward through those because most of the times these wildlife cams especially do go back about 24 hours, so you could pick your date. Okay. Thank you both for sharing. I really appreciate that. I am gonna move on to the next slide and just invite you all to explore our website. Steph is going to put in the chat the link for a fillable document for you can get 1 contact hour completion of a certificate of completion for 1 contact hour for attending live. So she'll put that in there. And then if you want to join us for our summer educator retreat, there is still spaces available for that. And you're more than welcome to explore that as well. So That's gonna wrap us up for tonight, and I'm gonna go ahead. Does anybody have any more questions? If you want to raise your hand, I can unmute you at this time, or if you want to put it in the chat as well. Yes, thank you all, everyone, for attending. I didn't say that. Thank you, Rustina, for sharing that. Thank you for coming. And yes, please reach out if you have any questions. We'll stay on for a minute longer. I'm going to go ahead and stop my recording.